Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
So now what's going to happen is, now that we're outside of Jerusalem, now that we're expanded, for instance, we saw how it was that we went into Samaria. Are the Samaritans Jews? So now we're going to start these missions into Gentile places, like Pella, which is our new headquarters, now that we're out of Jerusalem. Like Samaria, the church is going to begin spreading. Because Hellenist Christians, or Jews at that time, were the first to be persecuted, they were the first to be scattered. So think about that for a moment. Who was the first one to be targeted by Saul's companions? The Hellenists. So who were the first people to be running out of Jerusalem? The Hellenist Jews who believed in Jesus. The Hellenist Jews for Jesus were the first ones to be running out of there. So they were the first ones to be scattered, taking the message with them. Acts chapter 8 says that they were scattered through Judea and Samaria. So at first, the Acts of the Apostles tells us they were scattered throughout Judea, the southern kingdom, and Samaria, which was between Judea and Galilee. Acts chapter 9 tells us of Peter's visits to Christian communities in Lydda, Sharon, and Joppa, all of which are in Judea, which gives us this idea that the church is beginning to spread outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jesus died, Jesus rose again, but now the message is starting to spread. Different people are starting to believe. Different people are becoming Jews for Jesus and are believing in Jesus and are in different places. Acts 9 suggests that they were scattered as far as Damascus. What happened to Damascus? Where did Saul have his conversion? Where did Saul fall to the ground and hear Jesus speaking to him? That was on the road to Damascus. And in Damascus, he met a gentleman who was there when he received his sight and came to really see that Jesus was Lord. So the Christian message had already spread to Damascus. Acts chapter 11 says, those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch. So because of this persecution, these Jews for Jesus are going in all directions now. Who are they speaking with? Acts chapter 11 says they were speaking the word to none except Jews. Were we spreading the word to Gentiles yet? No. We were just telling our friends, hey, I'm a Jew, you're a Jew. I just want to tell you though, the Messiah has come. We're Jews for Jesus now. Let me tell you about the Messiah so that you can believe in him too. So who is the first non-Jew? Think about this for a moment. So all these were Jews so far. We have the Hebrews and the Hellenists, but they were all Jews. Who's going to be the first? So we were all Jews for Jesus. Who's going to be the first one for Jesus who's not a Jew? Who? Follow me now? Because we're coming to a break in the history. We were all Jews for Jesus. Some of us were Hebrews and some of us were Hellenists, but we were all Jews for Jesus. Now what's the new chapter in our history, in our story? Now we're going to have Gentiles for Jesus. Follow me now? We were all Jews for Jesus. We were Jews who believed the Messiah came. His name was Jesus. Now, the first Gentile ever, what country is it going to be from? Ethiopia. The story is told of how it is that with Philip's mission in Samaria, we have the conversion of the first Gentile who was the Ethiopian eunuch. We pause for a moment. Eunuch, we're familiar with what a eunuch was. A eunuch was a gentleman who lost what made him a gentleman. He lost the organs of his masculinity, often because the eunuchs were like serving people of royalty, right? If you were attending the queen, but you were a man, we didn't trust you attending the queen so long as you were capable of violating the queen. We were not going to have that. So in order to attend the queen, you had to be a eunuch. Okay? The first Gentile, the first non-Jew for Jesus was the Ethiopian eunuch. In Acts chapter 10, Peter and Cornelius meet, And now there comes this question. Cornelius is not a Jew. Can I believe in Jesus if I'm not a Jew? What conclusion are we going to come to? Yeah, sure. Acts chapter 11. Then to the Gentiles also God has granted repentance unto life. So God came first for the Jews, but the conclusion we came to is God came for us Jews so that we could be Jews for Jesus. But God didn't just come for us Jews. God also came for y'all. Those of you who are Gentiles, God came for you too. So it's not just Jews for Jesus anymore. Now it's Jews and Gentiles for Jesus. How's that for a name for our organization? We're going to call ourselves the Jews and Gentiles for Jesus. Actually, we didn't call ourselves the Jews and Gentiles for Jesus, but that's what we were. We were Jews and Gentiles now who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Many of us who are Gentiles were already God-fearers, which simply means that many people like Cornelius, who was a God-fearer, what did that mean? He already believed in this concept of a God. I mean, it's just, he was a Gentile, but he was a believer in Jesus, waiting to be. Barnabas was then sent to Antioch, and when he came and saw the grace of God that was being worked among the Gentiles, he was glad. So now what we see is the spread. The people who are coming to believe in Jesus are more and more Gentile and less Jews. So the question becomes, do Gentiles need to obey our laws, our Jewish laws? As Jews, we have 613 laws. Should the Gentiles have to obey all of them, including our dietary restrictions? No lobster, no shrimp, no crawfish, no pork. Do the Gentiles have to follow those? And the law of circumcision, the removal of the male skin from the male, we remember that as well. Should we force that on the Gentiles as well? What conclusion are we going to come to? Not necessary. Remember that from our course in Pauline letters, right? After some hesitation, the church in Jerusalem accepted the Gentiles into the church in Jerusalem. It ended the debate, but we recall from our study of Paul's letters that there were many Judaizers. Who were the Judaizers? The Judaizers were the Jews for Jesus who believed that we needed to continue to follow those 613 laws. And so St. Paul found himself having to write against them, saying, no. Before the next person is circumcised or gives up pork, no, we don't have to follow these 613 laws. The Gentiles are not subject to those laws. How interesting. Paul and Barnabas were rejected in Antioch of Pisidia. Why? Because they accepted other God-fearers. The Jews for Jesus weren't ready for that. The Jews for Jesus in Pisidia of Antioch, they were not ready to accept Gentiles for Jews. They were thinking, this group should just be Jews for Jesus. We're not ready to accept the Gentiles into our group yet. If so, we'll have to change the name of our group. We'll no longer be Jews for Jesus. So the story of Paul then, Paul is up farther north on the coast in Antioch. So in Antioch then, that's going to be the base of Paul's missionary journeys. If we remember back to our course on Paul's letters. Paul spent a year in Antioch with Barnabas, where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. How interesting. We were Jews for Jesus. We were Gentiles for Jesus. For the first time, we get a new name in the city where Paul finds himself. What are we going to call ourselves for the first time? Followers of Christ. Or the English word that we use today, Christians. Where did that word Christ come from? Again, the word Christ was the Greek translation of Messiah. Messiah, translated into Greek as the anointed, or as Christ. So we're followers of the anointed one. We're going to call ourselves Christians. That word first appears in Antioch. Paul then is going to travel from Antioch to all sorts of places, including Cyprus and Asia Minor and Greece and over into Rome, perhaps even into Spain. We don't know. We know that he talked about wanting to go to Spain. We don't know if he ever made it. But Paul wasn't the first to take the Christian message to many of those places, and Deacon Roy pointed out. Romans says that there was a church in Rome already that Paul was writing to. He didn't start the church in Rome. He was writing to the church in Rome. Paul's significance to the spread of Christianity should not be exaggerated, says Dr. Gonzalez. There were many others preaching in various regions. So what was Paul's contribution? Undoubtedly his letters. There were all these preachers who were preaching Jesus. What did Paul do that was different? He wrote about Jesus, and his letters were kept by people down to the present day. What was his message? That the promises made to Israel are fulfilled, the age of the Messiah has dawned, the Messiah has come, and the way is open for Gentiles to be part of this as well. So the Messiah has come. We call him Jesus. The way is open for Gentiles too. Gentiles are not Jews. You have to be born into the Jewish race. If you're not born a Jew, you're not a Jew. Gentiles, however, can become followers of this good news. What's going to happen now that we're no longer identifying ourselves with Jews? We now have this other name, Christians. Are we going to be welcomed in places like Jewish synagogues? When we go into the synagogues on Saturday to hear the word and to be able to talk to them about how excited we are that the Messiah came, are they going to be welcoming us and wanting to hear about how the Messiah came and was this crucified criminal somewhere in Judea? No. We were expelled from the synagogues. So for the first time, Christians, and we'll start using the name Christians now, because we're no longer Jews for Jesus or Gentiles for Jesus. Now we're using this word Christians, which started out of Antioch. The Christians are going to be expelled from the synagogues. We're no longer welcome because we don't believe what they believe. Right? They're going to look at us and say, we love y'all, but you no longer believe what we believe. It's time for you to go. Angelita, we really like you, but you're preaching that the Messiah came, and we don't believe that. Go find someone else who believes that and talk with them. So where did we start gathering? Now that we can no longer gather in synagogues, start gathering in people's homes. Angelita's having tea tomorrow afternoon for anyone who'd like to come and join and talk about how the Messiah has come. We're going to meet in people's private homes. And that's how the church, the early church, started to gather. We'd meet in private homes to break bread and to find support, especially among all of the persecutions that we're going to start breaking out.
I have a question.
Please.
So there is an understanding that these Christians, or the Jews for Jesus, gathered on Sunday to break bread, but the Jewish religion gathers on Saturday.
Correct.
So did they gather at the temples, at the synagogues to break bread?
Ooh, excellent question. No, probably not. So we gathered at the synagogue on the Sabbath on Saturdays to be able to break the word open and to be able to talk about what that means for our lives. But then for the Christians, we had this, the first day of the week, we're going to start the week off by watching the sunset together and breaking bread. So I'm imagining that many of their celebrations were outdoors. There's one ancient document, I'm trying to think which it is, perhaps where it talks about how the Christians essentially were gathering outdoors and watching the sunset and breaking bread. Until we could no longer do it outdoors. There comes a point in our history where we can no longer do this out. We can't go outside and start singing our songs and breaking bread outside because people are going to out us as being Christians. In order to watch the sun rise, I'm presuming that many of our ancestors were watching it rise outside if possible. Thoughts?
Well, I'm just wondering if that happens all over, since it's spread quite a bit, and that's a significant aspect of
Excellent question.
The belief of the religion. That's what I'm thinking.
Excellent question, because what's going to happen is as it spreads, the records that we have are so sparse that we don't know how it was different in different places. Dr. Gonzalez is later going to go on to say that there were different Christianities, there were different ways of living this new Christian life. So what you were doing in one community could be very different from what people are doing in another community. So we're meeting in private homes then to break bread. After that, the catechumenate arose, which simply meant that different people were wanting to join us. Now that we were calling ourselves Christians, people wanted to become Christians, okay? Well, we need to find a way to be able to teach them what it means to be a Christian. And so we start designating people like Terry to be able to teach people, okay, if there are any newcomers who come to us, let's not start over our course of everything we've been learning here. Instead, maybe, Terry, if you could just go and teach them where they are and help to bring them up to speed on everything that we believe, right? So the catechumenate arose as a way to be able to instruct converts. Liturgy was divided so that what would happen then is that we would have the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. In the 1960s, we tried to reclaim that tradition again, right? The liturgy of the Word, what does that mean? That Terry brings all of the converts in, we all listen to the Word of God together, but they're converts who haven't yet been baptized. So we're going to let them break bread with us?
No.
Why don't we do this? Why don't we let them hear the word and hear the preaching and pray with us for the needs of the church? But after that, Terry, if you don't mind, right, what we'll do is we'll excuse them. It's because they're not baptized. They're not one with us yet, so that they'll go off and continue learning while the rest of us break bread together as a symbol of our unity. They're not one with us yet. Facts and legends about the apostles. This is going to be fascinating, how it is that in history there arose various stories about different saints. Have you heard some of these stories? Traditions began appearing that apostles preached in particular places to justify the claims of apostolic origins. Think about this for a moment, right? That in Jerusalem, they're saying that people like Peter preached in Jerusalem. Antioch, people like Paul were in Antioch. Well, what about Alexandria? If you're living over here in Alexandria, can we say that anyone ever came to Alexandria and visited us? How did the church ever get here? Did these common, nameless people bring Christianity here? Or was it someone great? What stories can we tell about how it is that Christianity came to our place? What are some of the stories that are going to arise then? Well, one is that Christianity came to Rome through Peter. How interesting. Was Peter ever the Bishop of Rome? Not that we have any knowledge of. How interesting, right? The Pope has always been considered the successor of Peter. What a fascinating thing that the church originated in this part of the world and not over here in Italy, but somehow over here in Italy, their claim is that Peter began their church. Peter was in Rome. We don't doubt that for a moment. We know that Peter suffered martyrdom, or we believe that Peter was in Rome and suffered martyrdom at the hands of Nero. How did Paul die? Think back to our course in Paul's letters. Do we know how Paul died? Actually, we don't. In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul is still alive at the end of the book. There's the tradition that he died in Rome. If he died in Rome as a Roman citizen, then he was probably beheaded, which means what? That often we see statues of St. Paul holding a sword. Interesting. Often St. Paul will have a book in one hand, a symbol of his letters, and a sword in the other, a symbol of how he died. Many saints will be holding, or will be pictured with how it is that they died. So Paul died by the sword according to the tradition, so he's often pictured with the sword. But who knows? There are people in Spain who claim that Paul came to Spain and started their community. John, we've heard of John. The challenge with John is that there are different people who are named John in the Bible. We have the Gospel of John. We have 3 letters by John. We have Revelation, which is written by a John. So that's 5 books there that were written by John. Were they written by one John, 5 different Johns, 4, 3, 2? How many Johns were they written by? We don't know. And so the tradition there is, we'll come back to that when we talk about the persecutions and Revelation. We just don't know who wrote these books or who happened to them. But you can imagine how it is that people would claim that John started their community. Others that are fascinating then, Alexandria, we talked about over here in Egypt at the mouth of the Nile River. Alexandria is a great center of learning. Well, who brought Christianity to Alexandria? We started telling the story that it was Mark. Did Mark ever make it to Alexandria? Don't know. We don't have any record. But the people in Alexandria started saying that Mark was the one who brought the message to Alexandria. What about Constantinople? Constantinople, over in Turkey, the head of the empire, right after Rome is sacked in 405, 407 AD, the empire is going to move to Constantinople. But was there ever an apostle who preached in Constantinople? We have a story for that too. The story was that Philip preached in Constantinople. Other ones that are fascinating are the legends that have to do with Spain. So there were legends about 5th century legends. So about 400 years after Christ, there were stories about how it was that Peter traveled to Spain. Do we have any record of that? No. 8th century legends from the 700s now, there are stories of how James traveled to Spain. According to the story, it's important for the history of Spain because enough people in Spain believed that James was in their country that certain things happened. One, the devotion to La Virgen del Pilar arose. Have you heard? I mean, there are different images of Mary. Are you familiar with La Virgen del Pilar? So what happened was, according to the story, James went off to preach all the way from the Holy Land, made it all the way over to Spain, and now in Spain he's not meeting with very much success, so Mary appears to him and encourages him. James, according to the stories that were told in the 8th century, so this is the 700s now, so James journeyed over there, was disappointed, was encouraged by Mary, traveled back to Jerusalem where he died. According to the story, he was beheaded. And then after that, according to the story, the disciples carried his body from Jerusalem all the way back to Spain, where it was later discovered at Compostela. Have you heard of Compostela? Santiago de Compostela became a shrine there in northern Spain, where the beauty was it united northern Spain. People from all over Spain came to Compostela. People from all over Europe came to be there at the burial site where they believe that St. James is buried. During our Crusades, who were we fighting with during the Crusades? The Muslims, the Moors, we call them, or the Saracens, the Moors. So sometimes we refer to St. James as Santiago Matamoros. Matamoros is also a city on the Mexican border. Have we heard of Matamoros? Matamoros. Santiago Matamoros. St. James was the patron saint of those who did what? Who killed the Moors, or the Muslims. So here we are, riding into the Crusades, shouting for St. James, the Moor slayer, the Muslim slayer, to protect us and to lead us to victory. How is this for putting all sorts of layers of meaning onto those early disciples and apostles? The other one that's interesting is St. Thomas. According to legend, St. Thomas made it all the way to India. Have you heard that story? Did you read the book? Did you read the story in this book by Dr. Gonzalez? He says, okay, according to the story, Thomas made it all the way here in the Holy Land, all the way over to India, which is way over there. And when he was in India, he met the king Gandaphares, and Gandaphares named St. Thomas, country bumpkin that he was, or who knows what he did before then, named him his architect, the architect of his palace. What happened according to the story, though? Thomas took all the money that he was given to build this palace and was giving some of it to the poor. Ooh, that's unacceptable, right? That money was not meant for the poor. That money was meant to build my palace. Until the king's brother dies in the story, comes back to life, and says, "King, brother, I have good news for you." That money that he was giving to the poor is being used to build a palace in heaven. Wow. Stories that come to us of the apostles. Was St. Thomas ever in India, and or did he ever speak with a King Gandaphares? We have no idea. But at the same time, those stories persist to the present day. And for people in India, you can imagine the pride of knowing that they are sons and daughters of St. Thomas having brought the message to their land.
When they were trying to get associate themselves with those people with brilliant names, as you would say, but was that to secure apostolic succession?
Excellent question. So that's a good insight. What happens is down here, for instance, if we're here in Alexandria, we have, what is apostolic succession? That is the belief that somehow the faith that we have was handed on to us by the apostles. So apostolic succession is important because that's what, if we remember back to so many courses, Archbishop William Johnson believes that he has apostolic succession, which means that he believes that he was consecrated by someone who's consecrated by someone who's consecrated by someone, that it goes all the way back to the apostles. So if we can claim that Mark was here in Alexandria, then that gives us certain claims to the apostolic origins, at least, if not the apostolic succession. So apostolic succession almost implies this: Mark handed off leadership to this person, handed off leadership to this person, apostolic succession. If nothing else, these were stories of apostolic origin, how it was that the faith in our city has its origin, if not its succession, at least its origin in those people. Apostolic succession, as we're going to see, is going to become very important in the 3rd century. So right now we're not thinking about apostolic succession, this phrase, so much. We don't have this phrase yet, but that become important in the 3rd century when we're trying to prove ourselves against various heretics in the church. That we can trace our faith all the way back to the apostles. Right now it's not about tracing our faith back to the apostles so much as saying, you know what, back in the beginning, Mark came to Alexandria. Have you heard the story? Let me tell it to you. So how interesting, it was almost as if we, with these stories of different disciples in different directions, ending up in different places like Spain or Italy or India or Egypt, it's almost as if the early Christians were imagining that the disciples sort of divided themselves up and said, okay, Chris, you take India. Dulce, what do you think about Russia? Why don't you go to Russia? Deacon Cleophas, what direction are you going to go? Maybe North Africa? You go for it, right? How it is, it's almost like they started dividing up different places and going out there. Dr. Gonzalez says that's probably not what happened. You know, it's probably not them dividing up and going in different directions, but it's probably, he says, the work of countless and nameless Christians who, as part of their travels, are simply telling people about Jesus. We're Jews or we're Gentiles who believe this one thing, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God.